This is a steel ship. Ships are typically made out of metals like steel because they can withstand the harsh conditions that ships face, such as corrosion from seawater and the immense pressures and forces involved in sailing through the ocean. But we know that metals like steel are dense and heavy, and so this begs the question, why doesn't this ship sink when it's made out of metal? In fact, steel ships float because they displace an amount of water that is equal to their weight. It's just like icebergs. Although icebergs are made out of freshwater ice, which is less dense than salt water, only about 1/9 of the iceberg is above the surface of the water, whereas the rest of it is hidden beneath the waves. Similarly, most of the ship is below the water, holding up the top part of the ship that you and I see above the waterline. The ratio of a ship's weight to the volume of water it displaces is known as its density, which is why engineers often refer to ships as floating boxes of air. So if we were to take the Titanic, for example, which was made out of iron and steel, although these materials are very heavy, the amount of space or volume that they occupy means that overall the Titanic had a lower density than the water around it. So it floated. However, once the Titanic got a hole in it, water began to fill up the inside of the ship, making it heavier and less buoyant. And eventually the weight of the water inside the ship exceeded the amount of water it was displacing. And this is what caused the Titanic to sink. It's similar to placing a weight at the bottom of a swimming pool. The weight has a certain amount of buoyancy pushing it upwards, but as soon as the weight becomes too heavy, then the weight starts to sink, and eventually it hits the bottom of the pool. In other words, the ship will sink when it takes in more water than it can displace. But there is another factor that helps the ship float, and that is the shape of the ship. The shape of the hull of a ship helps to displace more water as the ship sails along, and this increases the amount of buoyancy acting on the ship, allowing it to float. This is why wide ships generally float better than narrow ships. In fact, the deeper a ship's hull is, the more water it displaces. This is why deep-sea cargo ships have hulls that are deeper than cruise ships, allowing them to carry more goods without sinking. And the flatter the bottom of a ship's hull is, the more water it will displace. This is why flat-bottom barges are able to carry huge amounts of materials like gravel, sand, and coal. They are also used as oil tankers too. What's interesting is that the deeper and wider a ship is, the less likely it is to rock or roll in rough seas, making it more stable. Take a look at these two ships here. One is a deep and wide ship, whereas the other one is tall and skinny. If a wave hits the side of the tall, skinny ship, it will cause it to rock or roll much more than the wide and deep ship. Now, you might have noticed that most ships have two holes near the bottom of the ship. These are known as bilge keels. They are small indentations that run the entire length of the ship. They aren't actually holes, but instead they are structural parts of the hull of the ship that help it to steer in the water by reducing drag. And they also help to keep the ship stable, similar to how a bike remains upright when you ride it along. Bilge keels also help the ship sail better in shallow waters, as well as helping it to maneuver at low speeds. But they also help to keep the ship afloat. When a ship first begins to move through the water, friction between the water and the hull of the ship causes the ship to slow down, almost as if an invisible force is holding it back. This is known as hydrodynamic resistance or drag. When a ship sails into the wind pushes against the front of the ship, which makes the ship go slower. So to make up for this loss in speed, ships need to move more water out of the way, which requires more energy. The bilge keels on a ship provide grip in the water, helping the ship to maintain its speed and also helping it to steer through the water. So to summarize, ships float because they displace an amount of water that is equal to their weight. However, the shape of the ship also plays an important role in determining whether or not the ship will float. A wider and deeper ship will displace more water, and so will be more buoyant than a narrower and shallower ship. Bilge keels also play an important role in helping a ship to stay afloat by reducing drag in the water. But what about icebergs? Why do they float? Well, icebergs are made out of freshwater ice, whereas the water around them is most likely salt water. Since fresh water is less dense than salt water, the average density of an iceberg is lower than the surrounding water, allowing it to float. This is why you see most of the iceberg above the water, whereas the rest of the iceberg is hiding beneath the waves. If the temperature of the water around the iceberg is lower, then the density of the water is higher. As a result, more of the iceberg will be submerged beneath the water. If the temperature of the water around the iceberg is warmer, then the density of the water is lower, and so more of the iceberg will be visible above the surface. Interestingly, there is a myth that says that when an iceberg melts, the water level will remain the same. However, this is not true. When an iceberg melts, the water level will rise because even though the iceberg was floating, most of it was still made up of freshwater ice, which is less dense than seawater. And so, when the iceberg melts, the fresh water will flow into the ocean, increasing the overall water level. You might think that since an iceberg floats, the volume of the iceberg must be equal to the volume of water that it displaces. But this is not the case. Let me explain. Imagine we have an iceberg that looks like this. Now imagine melting the iceberg until only half of the iceberg is left. Even though the volume of the iceberg has been reduced by half, the volume of water that it displaces has not changed. This is because the water around the iceberg pushes up against the iceberg, forcing the iceberg to displace more water than its own volume. And this is why when the iceberg melts, the volume of water that is displaced by the iceberg is greater than the volume of the iceberg itself. And so, when an iceberg melts, the water level will rise. Speaking of icebergs, this is why some ice cubes float in your drink and others don't. If the ice cube is made out of pure fresh water, then it will float. However, if the ice cube is made out of impure water that contains lots of minerals and salts, then the ice cube will sink. This is because when water freezes, it expands in volume, which makes the density of ice less than the density of water. However, when minerals and salts are dissolved into the water, the expansion of the water when it freezes is reduced, which means that the density of the ice is almost the same as the density of the water, so the ice sinks. Now you know why ships and icebergs float. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you in the next video.